As Eisenhower's second term drew to a close in 1959 and 1960, voters were restless. The economy was in recession. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik and its long-range missile development sparked fears that the U.S. was falling behind. The setbacks of the U-2 incident and Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union made Americans question if they were losing the Cold War. The Democratic nominee for president in 1960 was Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, and he promised active leadership. His Republican opponent, Richard M. Nixon, hoped to win by riding the coattails of Eisenhower's popularity. Concerns over Kennedy centered largely around the fact that he was a Roman Catholic and that he was young. At age of 43, he would be the second youngest president in history. Kennedy and Nixon took part in the first televised presidential debate on September 26, 1960. 70 million viewers tuned in and watched. Nixon, a foreign policy expert, hoped to expose JFK's inexperience, but JFK was coached by TV producers and he looked and spoke better than Nixon. Kennedy's success in the debate launched the television age of American politics. It has often been said that those who listened to this debate on the radio believed that Nixon won, but those who watched the televised debate gave the debate to Kennedy. A second major event in the campaign came when police in Atlanta arrested Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter. King was sentenced to months of hard labor for his role in organizing the protest. Kennedy pledged to release King if elected, thus capturing the attention of the African American community whose votes would help him carry the election. The election of 1960 was the closest since 1884. Kennedy won by fewer than 119,000 votes. His inauguration set a tone of grace, eloquence, and wit for his administration. In his inaugural address, he said, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy and his family were loved by the media. His youthful glamour and talented advisors reminded many of the fabled court of King Arthur, and so the Kennedy White House became known as Camelot. From the beginning, Kennedy focused on the Cold War. He thought that the Eisenhower administration had not done enough about the Soviet threat. Eisenhower had relied on the policy of a massive nuclear retaliation to deter Soviet aggression. Kennedy did not want to risk nuclear war over a minor conflict. Instead, JFK's advisors developed a policy of flexible response, giving the U.S. the ability to fight limited wars around the world. Kennedy boosted defense spending to increase conventional military forces and also created an elite branch of the Army called the Special Forces, or Green Berets. He also tripled the nuclear capabilities of the United States. Thus, the U.S. became capable of fighting limited wars around the world while maintaining a balance of nuclear power with the Soviets. The first test of JFK's foreign policy came from Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. 2 weeks before JFK took office, Eisenhower cut off relations with Cuba because a revolutionary leader named Fidel Castro had aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union. Castro relied increasingly on Soviet aid and the political oppression of those who did not agree with him. In March 1960, Eisenhower gave the CIA permission to secretly train Cuban exiles for an invasion of Cuba. It was hoped such an invasion would trigger a mass uprising that would overthrow Castro. JFK learned of the plan only 9 days after his election. Although he had his doubts about its ability to succeed, he approved it. On April 17, 1961, about 1,500 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. Nothing went as planned. The invasion force was met by over 25,000 Cuban soldiers armed with Soviet tanks and aircraft. The disaster embarrassed JFK. He warned that he would resist further communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere, but Castro welcomed further Soviet aid. During the summer of 1962, the flow of Soviet arms to Cuba increased greatly and included Soviet nuclear missiles that could easily hit the United States. In October 1962, a U.S. aircraft photographed Soviet missile bases in Cuba and revealed that some sites were ready to launch their missiles at the U.S. JFK informed the nation of this crisis on October 22nd. He made it clear that any missile attack from Cuba would trigger an all-out U.S. response against the Soviet Union. For the next 6 days, the world faced the terrifying possibility of a nuclear war. JFK imposed a naval blockade of Cuba, which vowed to stop Soviet ships carrying more missiles to Cuba. In Florida, 100,000 U.S. troops were poised to invade the small island. The first break in the crisis came when Soviet ships bound for Cuba stopped in the Atlantic and then turned back for the Soviet Union before reaching the American naval blockade. A few days later, Khrushchev offered to remove his missiles in Cuba in return for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. The U.S. also secretly agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, which borders the Soviet Union. One goal that guided JFK through the missile crisis was his determination to prove to Khrushchev his determination to contain communism. JFK was constantly reminded over their recent confrontation in Berlin. In 1961, Berlin was in turmoil. In the 11 years since the Berlin airlift, more than 3 million East Germans, 20% of East Germany's population, had fled communist oppression by escaping into West Berlin. Their departure signaled the failure of East Germany's communist government and greatly weakened the country's economy. Khrushchev realized this problem had to be solved. He once again threatened to blockade West Berlin, but was stopped by America's superior nuclear striking power. Instead, Khrushchev ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961, and within days, East Germany was separated from West Berlin. The construction of the Berlin Wall ended the Berlin crisis, but aggravated Cold War tensions. It also became an ugly symbol of communist oppression. Showdowns between JFK and Khrushchev made both leaders aware of the gravity of the tensions that separated Cold War peace from nuclear disaster. In 1963, JFK announced that the two nations had established a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. This enabled the leaders of the two countries to communicate at once should another crisis arrive. Later that year, the U.S. and the Soviet Union also agreed to a limited test ban treaty that barred nuclear testing in the atmosphere. All future nuclear tests must be conducted below ground. On the home front, JFK's broad vision of progress was known as the New Frontier. He called on Americans to be new pioneers and explore uncharted reaches of science and space, as well as unconquered pockets of poverty, ignorance, and prejudice. Although he lacked strong support in Congress, JFK did manage to convince Congress to enact measures to boost the economy, provide international aid, and fund a massive space program. JFK tackled the economy by pushing for the use of deficit spending, the same tactic used by FDR. Congress approved increased defense spending and increased the minimum wage to $1.25 per hour. That's right, minimum wage, 1961, 1963, $1.25 an hour. They extended unemployment insurance and provided assistance to cities with high unemployment. JFK also created the Peace Corps, a program of volunteer assistance to developing nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Peace Corps became a huge success. American youth signed up to serve as agricultural advisors, teachers, and health aides to these undeveloped countries. On April 12, 1961, Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. JFK saw this as a challenge and decided that the U.S. should surpass the Soviets by sending a man to the moon. In less than 1 month, the U.S. duplicated the Soviet feat by putting Alan Shepard in space. Later that year, the first American communication satellite was also in orbit. America's National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, worked to put a man on the moon and would do so on July 29, 1969. By the fall of 1963, polls showed that JFK was losing popularity because of his advocacy of civil rights, but still most supported him. On November 22, 1963, however, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president, took the oath of office aboard Air Force One as it flew Kennedy's slain body back to Washington. Dallas police charged Lee Harvey Oswald with JFK's murder, but on November 24th, Oswald was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby as he was being transferred from the Dallas jail. This bizarre chain of events caused many to question whether or not Oswald was part of a conspiracy and if he in fact acted alone in Kennedy's assassination. The Warren Commission was established and investigated the assassination and concluded that Oswald had acted alone, but questions still persist to this day. LBJ, as Johnson was known, was an experienced politician from Texas whose political career had been guided initially by FDR. LBJ proved himself a master at party politics and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. In the wake of JFK's assassination, LBJ asked Congress to pass the civil rights and tax cut bill that JFK had sent to Capitol Hill. In July of 1964, LBJ pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. It prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex, and granted the federal government new powers to enforce its provisions. In August of 1964, Congress passed the Economic Opportunity Act, which provided youth programs and anti-poverty measures, including such programs as Head Start for underprivileged preschoolers. In the 1964 election, Johnson easily defeated Republican candidate Barry Goldwater when Goldwater let it be known that he advocated for American intervention in Vietnam, even if it meant using nuclear weapons. LBJ promised American voters that he would not send their sons to die in Southeast Asia in an attempt to contain communism. And he made that promise when, in fact, he was already sending troops to Vietnam. In May of 1964, LBJ summed up his vision for America in a phrase, "The Great Society." He outlined a legislative program that would end poverty and racial injustice. Like his idol, FDR, LBJ wanted to change America. By the time LBJ left the White House in 1969, Congress had passed 206 of his measures, and he had personally led the battle to get most of them passed. Great Society programs included the following. In education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which provided $1 billion to help schools purchase new textbooks and new library materials. In healthcare, Medicaid and Medicare provided hospital insurance and low-cost medical insurance for Americans 65 and older, as well as for welfare recipients. In housing, it established the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and helped build public housing for low-income families. And in regard to immigration, the Immigration Act of 1965, which removed quotas on immigration established in the 1920s. There were also several major court decisions from the Supreme Court in the 1960s that affected American society. The Warren Court, as it was known, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, banned state-sanctioned prayer in public schools and upheld free speech rights of students in school to some degree. The court also brought about changes in the federal and state reapportionment and the criminal justice system. Several notable cases included Baker v. Carr, 1962, which established the principle of one person, one vote. Federal courts had the right to tell states to redivide their districts for more equal representation. Mapp v. Ohio in 1961, in which the court ruled that evidence seized illegally could not be used in court. Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963, in which the Supreme Court said that courts are required to provide free legal counsel to those who could not afford it. You cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Escobedo v. Illinois, 1964. The accused persons have the right to have an attorney present during police questioning. And finally, one that everybody should be familiar with from watching TV shows, Miranda v. Arizona, 1966. All suspects must be read their rights before questioning, and so those rights have become known as the Miranda rights. The Great Society and the Warren Court changed the United States. LBJ's war on poverty did help the nation, but many of its provisions were hastily conceived and proved difficult to accomplish. LBJ's massive tax cuts spurred the economy, but funding the Great Society contributed to a growing budget deficit, a problem that would persist for decades. A conservative backlash began to take shape as a new group of Republican leaders rose to power. In 1966, for example, a conservative Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan swept to victory in the race for governor of California over the Democratic incumbent. But thousands of miles away, the increase of communist forces in Vietnam also began to overshadow the goals of the Great Society. Only 4 years after campaigning as a peace candidate, LBJ would be labeled a hawk or supporter of one of the most divisive wars in recent American history.